Father, one thing I wanted to ask you about, we had discussed in private, and you've made a video online about it, is you read the early fathers. You read Gregory the Great, and you have monks, holy women. I was just reading about a nun who they pulled her out of the convent because there was someone in town that was possessed. She comes out of the convent, cloistered nun, makes a sign of the cross, says one prayer, the demon's out of her. She goes back in the
Yeah.
cloister. And today, we don't see that as often. In fact, sometimes deliverance and exorcism can take months, maybe years and all that. And you had a really
Right.
good answer as to why that is. And I'd like you to share that with the people because it helps us understand the state of the church.
Yeah, it actually does. That's an interesting question, because it's even the same question we get from bishops from time to time, because they think once they give you faculties, it should be over in a couple of sessions. And that's just, once in a while that does happen, but that's because the level of possession is lower. But in general, it's taking much longer in order to liberate people. There are some references in some of the very old Latin commentaries and discussions written by exorcists, like in the 16th century, even before. But usually it's a little bit later. And then also Amorth, I think it was the first one. It was Amorth or Bamonte, one of the two. Anyway, who made the observation that exorcism doesn't work ex opere operato. It would be fantastic if it did. For Christ, it did,
Mm-hmm.
but that's because of the fact that his prayer was perfectly efficacious. So he just had perfect coercive power over demons. But unfortunately, we don't have that. But so what that means is, and it doesn't work ex opere operantis in the sense that it's just entirely up to the sanctity and the devotion of the priest, although that does play a part in it. It's based upon what they say, it's ex opere operantis ecclesiae, which basically means, to translate it, from the work of the doer, the church, basically. And so it's the church. The exorcisms, for example, even the ones you see in the baptismal rite and the old rite, and in the solemn exorcisms and all these things, they're all basically sacramentals, and so they work upon the efficacy, and because they're a public prayer of the church, they work based upon the state of the church. It does, just by virtue of the fact that the church does have a certain degree of holiness, etc., it does always have an effect, but the degree of the effects are a bit fluid throughout time, and so before the council, they used to say that, you'd read these guys and they'd say, 1 to 2 days, maybe a week on the outside when someone would get liberated once you got faculties. And the faculties, of course, come from the church as well. So it's the application of the church, it's public prayer of the church to the individual. So the state of the church has a direct impact on how long and how efficacious the prayers that are being said by the priest, who's the public minister of the church, for the person who's possessed. And it's because of that, it's because of the state of the church, many exorcists theorize, is why it's taking so much longer. Because in addition to the demons being stronger because people are just a lot more evil, the church is much more debilitated, and people just aren't leading holy lives that are in the church, or very few are. Some are, but they're very few. And as a result of that, their prayers are less, the prayers of the priests are less efficacious, and you can kind of see it. And it's even ebbed and flowed even since I was started being an exorcist 15 years ago. When I first started, it'd take about 10 months to 2 years to liberate someone on average. It ebbs and flows, but on average. And then there's something that actually happened in the life of the church. There's speculation about what that is, but it went to 2 to 3 months. Then about 6 months after that, maybe about a year on the outside, it's now much longer. The demons take a pretty brutal beating, but getting them rooted out has become extraordinarily difficult. And a lot of the exorcists across the board are talking about these cases that they're getting, that they're not liberating. It's just taking forever, and you grind and you grind and you grind, and you hardly make any progress, etc. And that tells you that there's something in the life of the church that needs rectifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's the power is coming from, it's not the treasury of merit, because that's the saints in heaven, right? What do we call this principle, the sort of the potency of the church militant? What is that theologically?
Well, they used to do. It is You're right in the sense that the spiritual treasury of the church is also the prayers of the merit of the prayers of the saints in heaven, etc. But it also is the merit of the prayers of the church militant, which go unanswered. So for a variety of different reasons. So those go into the spiritual treasury of the church. Well, first of all, there's hardly anybody praying these days. Second of all, the prayers aren't very efficacious because people have this idea that my prayer is meritorious, even though I'm in the state of mortal sin, and so I don't have to worry about these things or being, etc. But two, people just aren't leading very holy lives, and so the amount that's going into the spiritual treasury is just much less. And so that application of the spiritual treasury of the church is less. Now, in a certain sense, they say the spiritual treasury of the church is infinite because the merits of Christ, which are the spiritual treasury of the church, are infinite. That's true. That is true in one sense. But it kind of goes back to that observation we made towards the beginning of this interview, is the fact that the application of those things very often comes through us. And so there is the church, the mystical body of Christ, even though it's holy, in the sense that it's always sanctifying the people, it has a holy doctrine, etc., and it's always sanctifying the people's holiness ebbs and flows, and therefore their ability to merit ebbs and flows, because merit's based on sanctifying grace and how much you have. And so when that gets reduced, it means that the efficacy of the prayers of the church gets reduced. And we see that the exorcism is where the rubber meets the road. That's where you see the effect of it right there.
So, Father, if I understand you correctly, if, let's say, like in the early church, all the lay people were not eating meat on Fridays, or even in the early church, Wednesdays and Fridays. If
Right.
Lent, people were fasting till 3 p.m. and not eating eggs, dairy, all
Right.
that penance, all that, and not to mention you have actual martyrs. We have martyrs today, though, of course, but all
Right.
that's going on in the life of the church. Of course, there were sinners and hypocrites back then, but generally, the spiritual temperature was pretty high.
That's right.
During those centuries. Now our temperature is very low because people aren't even attending the holy sacrifice of the Mass.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So
and
we can help
masses
you.
being said, etc. What's that?
I was going to say, we could help you and other exorcists by we living, and I think that's kind of the auxilium prayers, is we do penance, we do prayers, and it's not just for penance for ourselves, but we're actually helping other people in the body of Christ find deliverance.
Yeah.
By raising the temperature.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the reasons why in the past, of course, they always said that the sins that people commit affect the rest of the mystical body. And also people's holiness affects the rest of the mystical body. And this is something that we have to see, when people say, well, my sin is private, and there's no sin that's private, in addition to the fact that it's going to be revealed at the end anyway, and it's all going to be public. The fact is that your sin or your holiness has a direct impact on the work of exorcists and the life of the church. And this is, and the fact that there's, like you said, less people, there's hardly, less people attending Mass. Somebody just recently emailed me and was complaining the fact they haven't been able to get to Mass in a year because they keep it shut down where they're at. It's in another country, etc. And so this has resulted in the mystical body's sanctity waning, I think, to some degree. I should say among its members, to be theologically precise.
Correct. Yeah. Makes sense.